The Ardennes forest in December 1944. Dark firs, narrow valleys, frozen rivers. Before dawn on 16 December, German guns opened along a front from Monschau to Echternach. 3 armies moved west under Army Group B. The plan aimed for the Meuse and Antwerp. The objective was to split the British and American armies and force a political crisis. The time window was days, not weeks. Germany's striking forces were concentrated and named. 6th Panzer Army stood on the northern axis under Sepp Dietrich. 5th Panzer Army held the center under Hasso von Manteuffel. 7th Army guarded the southern flank under Erich Brandenberger. The idea required speed surprise and fuel captured on the move. Winter weather was an ally if it grounded Allied aircraft. Across the line stood Allied formations spread thin. 1st Army under Courtney Hodges held the Ardennes sector with 8 corps dispersed on a long front. 3rd Army under George Patton waited south of the salient. Supreme Headquarters under Dwight D. Eisenhower coordinated reserves across the theater. The sector was judged quiet after the autumn campaigns. Many units were refitting or newly arrived. Intelligence signals were mixed and incomplete. German radio discipline had improved. Prior German patterns suggested defensive priorities. The expectation of a winter lull shaped Allied posture. The terrain favored a bold attacker and punished delay. Road nets were few and sinuous. River lines like the Our and the Clerf ran north to south through steep banks. Small towns controlled junctions at places like St. Vith and Bastogne. The Lauchheim Gap and Elsenborn Ridge defined the northern shoulder. The Meuse crossings at Givet, Dinant, and Namur defined the operational finish line. Every bridge mattered. Every village on a ridgeline mattered. The opening bombardment and infantry assaults achieved surprise in many sectors. American outposts reported heavy shelling and armor moving through the woods. Weather closed in and grounded fighter bombers. The German timetable aimed to reach the Meuse in 5 days. The margin for friction was small. This campaign became the largest battle fought by the United States Army in the war. It also became Germany's last major offensive in the West. The central question is precise. How did an attack that gained surprise and early momentum fail to achieve its operational goal? This episode follows the chronology to answer that question. It tracks plans, roads, fuel weather, and command choices. It begins at 16 December 1944 in the Ardennes. It ends when the Bulge recedes in January 1945. The stakes were theater level. The outcome shaped the final months of the war in Western Europe. Through autumn 1944, the Western Front shifted from rapid Allied advance to a grinding approach against the German frontier. After the breakout from Normandy and the encirclement at Falaise in August, Allied armies pushed across northern France and Belgium. By early September, forward elements reached the Meuse and the German border. Supply outran roads and ports. Antwerp was captured on the 4th of September, but its estuary remained in German hands until late November, keeping the port largely unusable. Fuel, ammunition, and bridge equipment had to move over long road hauls from Normandy beaches. 1st Army and 3rd Army rationed petrol by the drum. Artillery expenditure was capped by daily tables. The tempo slowed. Germany survived the summer disasters, but at severe cost. The Wehrmacht lost large numbers of experienced infantry and much of its remaining mobile equipment in Normandy and during the retreat to the Siegfried Line. Yet the defensive belt on the western border still existed in depth. In September and October, freshly raised Volksgrenadier divisions and rebuilt Panzer divisions took position behind belts of Dragon's Teeth and reinforced villages. The government mobilized older classes, returned convalescents, and rushed training battalions to fill ranks. Production still turned out tanks and assault guns, but fuel production had collapsed under bombing. Pilot training hours fell. Artillery ammunition output recovered unevenly. The army could stage an offensive only if it relied on short lines and captured Allied fuel. Hitler decided to attempt a decisive blow in the West before the Red Army's winter operations. He ordered a plan that sought to replicate the operational effect of 1940 on different terms. The directive named the main effort Wacht am Rhein. Its centerpiece was a concentrated armored breakthrough through the Ardennes toward the Meuse and Antwerp. The logic rested on several assumptions. Surprise could be achieved in a sector the Allies judged quiet. Weather in December could ground Allied tactical air for several days. The terrain channeled movement onto a few roads that German traffic control could manage if the assault was synchronized. Captured fuel would make up shortages after the first bound. The British and Americans, once split and facing a bridgehead west of the Meuse, might accept negotiations that left Germany room to fight in the east. Command relationships in the west were set by early autumn. OB West under Gerd von Rundstedt controlled Army Group B under Walter Model in the north and Army Group G in the south. For the Ardennes plan, the assault grouping concentrated under Model. 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich received the strongest armored divisions including 1st SS Panzer and 12th SS Panzer to attack between Monschau and the Losheim Gap toward the key road net near Malmedy and Stavelot. 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel assembled veteran armored and Volksgrenadier formations in the center to force crossings over the Auer and Sauer and pivot on Bastogne. 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger held a covering role on the southern flank toward Luxembourg and the Moselle. Reserve groupings included parachute forces for limited drops and bridge seizure if the weather allowed. The buildup began under strict secrecy in November. Rail movements were routed by night. March tables limited radio use. Units received sealed orders that revealed routes late and objectives later. Engineers stockpiled bridging gear for the Auer and Klurf. Assault gun units rehearsed road column drills on forest tracks. Traffic officers trained to clear choke points at village corners and ravines. Camouflage rules banned visible unit insignia. Dummy radio traffic misled Allied listeners toward Cologne and the Eifel. At forward assembly areas, fuel cans were stacked to support the first days, but the sums never matched the planned distances. Even with stripped depots, 6th Panzer Army went forward under ration with the expectation of seizing Allied petrol. On the Allied side, senior leaders read the late autumn situation through the lens of earlier months. After heavy fighting in the Huertgen forest and the clearing of the Scheldt, the Ardennes sector was assigned to rest and refit. The 8th Corps under Troy Middleton stretched across a broad front with divisions that were new to combat or recovering. Infantry and cavalry groups held outposts in towns and along ridge lines. Corps and army artillery could mass fires, but battalions were dispersed in depth. 1st Army under Courtney Hodges maintained reserves, and 3rd Army under George Patton faced east in the Saar, with its own offensive plans. Eisenhower's headquarters watched the front as a whole and kept strategic reserves, but the theater had many demands. Winter clothing, anti-frost lubricants, and snow chains were in distribution, yet shortages remained in battalions along the line. Intelligence indicators offered ambiguity rather than clarity. Ultra-decrypts that had framed so many operational choices in 1944 were less helpful, because German headquarters used more landlines and passed fewer high-level orders by radio. Aerial reconnaissance saw rail movements and new divisions in the Eifel, but the same pictures could support readings of a local counterattack or a reinforcement cycle. Prisoner interrogations reported fresh units, stricter discipline, and vague talk of a blow somewhere. Past experience suggested Germany would defend behind the West Wall and strike locally where the Allies pressed hardest. The Ardennes' quiet since September seemed an unlikely springboard for a winter offensive aimed at the sea. Weather became a factor by design as much as by chance. German planners counted on dense cloud and winter storms to limit Allied air reconnaissance and to ground fighter bombers in the opening week. Forecasts in mid-December called for just such a window. The ground itself promised help and hazard. Forest and deep-cut streams forced movement onto a limited road net. Villages like St. Vith and road hubs like Bastogne governed lateral movement. Bridges over small rivers mattered because detours were long and slopes steep. Where ridges ran east-west, a handful of paved roads with hairpin turns carried nearly all heavy traffic. Speed would depend on engineers clearing and controlling bottlenecks faster than defenders could blow them. The order of battle on the German side mixed sharp spearheads with brittle follow-ons. The leading armored divisions had Panthers and Panzer IVs at near paper strength and assault guns to fill gaps. Heavy tank battalions with Tiger II were parceled to key axes. Parachute divisions, now largely infantry, lined up to force river crossings by assault boat. Volksgrenadier divisions had many automatic weapons but weak artillery and limited motor transport. Artillery groups massed guns and rocket launchers for the opening barrage, yet ammunition stocks could not support weeks of high expenditure. Fuel trains lagged behind requirements even before the first kilometer. By contrast, the Allied logistic base, though strained, remained large and elastic. Depot stocks lay west in depth. The Red Ball Express had ended, but truck companies still moved fuel and shells on demand to threatened sectors. Corps and Army artillery pools allowed rapid reinforcement of any sector with additional battalions and heavier calibers. Armored combat commands could be cut out and sent by road at short notice. What the Allies lacked in the Ardennes line on 15th of December was density and tactical warning, not the potential to concentrate if time and roads allowed. Within the German High Command, debates over objectives and axes continued into December. Model and Manteuffel argued for realistic goals once the Allies reacted. They preferred a shorter swing to the Meuse, with options to pivot south of Liege. Hitler insisted on the deep strike toward Antwerp and forbade premature diversion. This insistence locked 6th Panzer Army to the northern shoulder, where the ground was narrow and guarded by high ground at Elsenborn. It also fixed the timetable. The Meuse had to be reached around the 5th day to preserve surprise and prevent Allied consolidation along the river line. Chronology tightened in the final week. By 10 December, major assault units were in assembly woods within a night's march of the line. Engineer parties marked approach lanes. Artillery registered silently on known terrain features. Supply officers issued cold weather rations and extra machine gun belts. Orders called for a heavy barrage at 05:30 on the 16th December, followed by infantry assaults at first light. Armored columns would push through as soon as crossings were secured. Special detachments carried English signboards for captured junctions. Fuel columns were instructed to follow closely with priority to spearheads and bridging trains. Allied dispositions on the eve reflected the sector's reputation. In the north near Monschau and Wallerscheid, veteran U.S. divisions pressed limited attacks against the west wall. In the center around Urin and Clairvaux, thin infantry regiments held long stretches with cavalry groups screening forest tracks. At St. Vith, a road web served as a corps node. South of Wiltz, the ground opened into rolling hills toward Bastogne, where 7 roads crossed. Corps boundaries, traffic plans, and artillery fire plans existed, but they were drawn for holding actions and local attacks, not a theater shock from 3 armies. The causes and buildup thus converged on a narrow window. Germany assembled strength in secrecy, banking on weather and road control to create a temporary advantage against a thin line. The Allies committed across a long front, accepted risk in a sector they believed quiet, while preparing new offensives elsewhere. Both sides entered mid-December, with plans shaped by logistics and time as much as by intent. When the guns opened before dawn on 16th December, the assumptions of both commands would be tested by roads, bridges, fuel, and the speed of reaction. Before dawn on 16th December, German artillery opened along a front from Monschau to Echternach. Shells walked across outposts and road junctions, while rocket launchers saturated assembly areas. Under the barrage, Volksgrenadier assault groups crossed the snow and moved into the draws that led to American platoon lines. At Wallerscheid and the Losheim Gap, the first objectives were the road cuts that fed the northern axis. In the center crossings over the Our and the Sauer were the gates to the road net toward Clairvaux and Bastogne. South toward Echternach, patrols probed for weak seams to widen the screen. In the North, 6th Panzer Army expected a rapid breach that would open the paved routes to Malmedy and the Meuse. Instead, the ground and the defense imposed friction from the first hours. At Krinkelt and Rocherath, veteran U.S. infantry backed by corps artillery fired pre-planned defensive concentrations that chewed up columns entering the village streets and the tree lines behind them. East of there, Elsenborn Ridge offered observation over narrow approaches. As morning lifted forward, observers corrected fire by sound and flash in the fog. Assault guns edged forward and withdrew under airburst shells. Traffic backed up along the forest roads leading to the ridge. The northern shoulder did not roll up on day one. The Losheim Gap became a bottleneck where road capacity fell behind the assault timetable. Engineers worked to clear mines and fill craters, but every delay compounded because the axis could not fan out. Behind the infantry came tanks and heavy tank battalions whose weight punished the frozen surface. When vehicles slid or stalled, they blocked the single lane and forced detachments to winch or detour. Staff officers pushed and reorganized, yet the queue lengthened. The ridge ahead still held, and the paved exits remained covered by registered fire. In the center, 5th Panzer Army forced the first real bends in the line. Under fog and snow, assault boats crossed the Our near Urin and Vianden. At some points, the current shoved boats downriver into eddies where men bailed with helmets and hauled on ropes. Engineers built footbridges and then low trestles under fire. Once a crossing lane opened, assault guns and half-tracks nosed across and infantry fanned out to seize the village edges. Oran fell after a short fight. At Clerf, the 28th Division formed a hedgehog among stone houses and held through the day, radioing that armor was in the streets. The defense cost hours and burned daylight. By night, the defenders withdrew in small groups as German columns pressed through. South of the center, 7th Army advanced methodically to screen the flank. Its job was to hold down U.S. forces near Luxembourg and keep them from striking the exposed southern side of the Bulge. The terrain broke into smaller fields and low hills where infantry could dig and wait while the main effort to the north carried on. Bridges over the Sauer became minor set pieces. Engineers on both sides timed demolition and bridging to the minute. Each span saved or lost changed the geometry of the following day. On 17 December, the attack sought to break free of the woods and gain the road net behind the first line. In the North Kampfgruppe, Piper, drawn from 1st SS Panzer Division, passed through the gap after nightfall and drove west with a heavy column of tanks and assault guns. At Hansfeld, it overran dumps and refueled from captured cans. At Buchholz Station and Ligneuville, it widened the rip by scattering small blocking forces. At midday near the crossroads south of Malmedy, an SS detachment shot a group of American prisoners under guard. News of the killings spread by evening and stiffened local resolve at every barricade and bridge west of the town. Piper reached Stavelot on 18 December and found the bridge still standing. The lead tanks crossed under fire before engineers could blow it, then turned northwest toward Trois Ponts to seize the next set of crossings. American engineers had prepared charges and roadblocks and now lit them as the column approached. At Trois Ponts, the bridge went up as Piper arrived. He turned toward L'Église and Chenu, seeking another way across the Amblève. The detours narrowed the route again to one road in a rolling bowl of hills where villages became nodal strongpoints. Local tank destroyer platoons and artillery fought from hull-down corners and used short fields of fire to make the German column deploy and redeploy. The northern armored spearhead was still east of the Meuse line and had already lost the initiative of time. North of St. Vith, the road grid looked like a spider web around a single knot. The knot was the town itself. On 17 and 18 December, elements of a U.S. armored division and a cavalry group organized a defense that oriented on keeping the road hub functional for withdrawals and counterattacks. Artillery set up along the western exits and fired concentrations across approaches that were registered with forward observers on church towers and ridgelines. German divisions closed from 3 sides and forced the defenders back step by step, but the fight over the hub cost the calendar more than the map. The longer the knot held, the more time reserve units had to steer around the Bulge. In the center, Manteufel's divisions drove on the roads that pointed at Bastogne. By 19 December, the focus had narrowed to that hub because it governed the lateral movement of both sides. Combat Command B of 10th Armored Division reached the town first and pushed out small teams to hold roundabout villages like Neuville and Longueville. The 101st Airborne Division detrained south of the town and marched in. As German columns arrived, a ring began to form. On 20th December, all outbound roads were under fire. Patrols reported armor and infantry assembling along all sectors. Inside the perimeter, engineers prepared street blocks and registered mortar lines. Outside it, reconnaissance X-rayed the woods for gaps. Weather through the first week favored the attacker. Low cloud grounded Allied fighter bombers and limited reconnaissance to short windows. Yet artillery never left the field. At Elsenborn, the defenders used a lattice of corps and division guns to hold the ridge and the road cuts that bypassed it. Fire direction centers concentrated missions within minutes on grid squares that led to Wallerscheid and Krinkelt. Counter-battery fire found rocket launchers by sound and range tables even when observers could not see bursts. The ridgeline became a fixed northern wall that Dietrich could not move without disproportionate loss. On 20 and 21st of December, Kampfgruppe Piper's momentum ended around L'Église and Stoumont. Bridges ahead were down, and every approach funneled into slopes and stone lanes overlooked by infantry with bazookas and machine guns. Fuel was low. Attempts to resupply by night met roadblocks and artillery interdiction at village corners. By 24 December, the group abandoned heavy vehicles and broke out on foot. The northern axis had failed to reach the Meuse and no longer held a mobile force west of the Amblève. At St. Vith, the defenders executed a fighting withdrawal in stages on 21st December after orders to avoid encirclement. The town fell, but the stand had consumed 5 days and forced German formations to detour over broken roads to continue west. The pause altered the geometry of the Bulge, bending it south and giving the Allies more time to seed roadblocks and bring up armor to the Meuse crossings. Around Bastogne, the siege tightened. By 21st December, German forces controlled the villages along the perimeter and cut the last roads. The garrison rationed shells and fuel and shifted companies by night to meet probes. On 22nd December, a German delegation presented a demand for surrender. The reply was short and negative. Fighting intensified at the perimeter villages where small rises controlled fields of fire over snowy pastures. Artillery observers climbed church towers under fire, were driven down, and moved to haylofts. Medics worked in cellars while supply officers counted rations to the day. Farther west, the leading elements of 2nd Panzer Division swung toward Dinant and the Meuse. On 23 and 24 December, their spearheads reached high ground near Celles and sighted the river valley beyond. They were nearly out of fuel. American Armored Combat Command's traffic, guided along priority routes, concentrated and counterattacked. The weather cleared and fighter bombers struck columns and road junctions in broad daylight. German crews parked tanks under trees and in stone farmyards and moved only at dusk. The pace that the plan demanded could no longer be kept. By 25 December, the opening phase had set the shape of the battle to follow. The northern shoulder at Elsenborn held. The Meuse crossings remained in Allied hands. Bastogne stood as a fixed node that drew German effort and tied up divisions that might otherwise have pressed west. The Bulge extended deepest toward Celles, but stalled under fuel shortages and counterattacks once the skies opened. The first week's gains were real in ground, but insufficient in time. The attack had lost the race to the river. The initiative was already shifting as Allied command synchronized reserves and air with the ground plan for relief and counterattack. The turning point came from 3 converging decisions and 1 change in the sky. First, on 19 December at Verdun, Eisenhower ordered a theater-level realignment built on simple rules of control and time. Hold the northern shoulder at Elsenborn Block, the Meuse crossings, and pivot. 3rd Army north to relieve Bastogne. 2nd Bradley shifted the army boundary so one commander controlled the threatened Meuse sector, enabling a single defensive belt from Givet to Namur. 3rd Middleton anchored a fortress defense at Bastogne that forced 5th Panzer Army to spend time and fuel circling a fixed point. Then the weather opened on 23 December, and air power returned. On the northern shoulder, the calculus never changed. The ground at Elsenborn Ridge gave observers long fields of view over narrow forest lanes. U.S. Corps and Division artillery used time-on-target missions to smash road columns before they could deploy. Forward observers called fire by sound and flash when fog hung low. German reports from 6th Panzer Army recorded battalions stacked on forest roads and batteries forcing fire missions through dwindling ammunition. The ridge was a wall, and every hour it held denied the timetable of Antwerp. Along the Meuse, the line that mattered was not the water, but the bridges. In the afternoon of 19 December, orders moved British and American engineers and armor to guard crossings at Givet, Dinant, and Namur. Demolition plans were laid with firing parties and plunger men sleeping in abutments. Roadblocks multiplied on the east bank, and traffic control sections directed every arriving American combat command to a named bridgehead box. When the first German spearheads neared the ridge east of Dinant on 24 December, the Meuse was already a defended river line in depth. The crossings remained intact for Allied use, and potentially gone for the attacker at minute's notice. The operational pivot was Patton's. For weeks, his staff had gamed contingencies to face north. When the order came at Verdun, the field tables already existed. 12 and 50 Corps would swing like doors, the hinges greased by pre-written march graphs, priority fuel, and traffic zones. In sleet and black ice, 3rd Army columns rolled at night on single headlamps. Bulldozers cleared jackknife trucks, engineers salted grades, MPs enforced one-way circuits. The distances were not enormous, but December roads and the Bulge's traffic made them decisive. By 23 December, spearheads of 4th Armored Division were fighting into the villages south of Bastogne. Inside Bastogne, the garrison turned space into time. Combat Command B of 10th Armored held road approaches with small detachments at Noville and Marvy. The 101st Airborne used regimental boxes tied to artillery and registered mortars. Fires were economized by day and massed by night. When the weather cleared, C-47s dropped bundles into snowfields on the edge of the town, while fighters strafed guns that had been firing unobserved for days. German regimental diaries in the Ring recorded ammunition shortages, cold stiff weapons, and orders to conserve fuel for local armor thrusts rather than the distant river. To the northwest, the deepest German point became a cul-de-sac. 2nd Panzer Division, having driven hard through Rochefort, reached the high ground near Celles on 24 December with tanks low on fuel. The American response combined road control and artillery with a local armored counterattack. Elements of 2nd Armored Division closed from the north and west, while airborne blocking forces held the line of the Lesse. When the weather opened, fighter-bombers marked columns and crossroads with rocket and cannon fire. The result was not a sweeping armored melee, but a set of short, brutal actions around hedgerows and stone farms. By 26 December, the German spearhead at Celles was broken and began to withdraw east, setting vehicles afire for lack of petrol to move them. Air power was the hinge between hours lost and momentum reversed. From 23 December 9th, Air Force and the Tactical Air Commands flew interdiction along the main roads from the Our to the Amblève. Bridges already strained by demolition attempts became priority targets. Bomb damage did not always drop spans, but it cratered approaches and created choke points that engineers could not bypass quickly. Jabos worked at dawn and mid-afternoon, when haze lifted, forcing German armor into night moves. Every kilometer in darkness cost fuel and schedule, and increased the chance of traffic snarls that artillery scouts could then range at first light. Air also mattered behind the line's depots at Saint-Vith and Houffalize, took hits that slowed artillery and rations from catching the front. Kampfgruppe Piper showed what the return of air and the loss of bridges meant on a single axis. After seizing the intact bridge at Stavelot on 18 December, the column had turned northwest, only to find the key crossings at Trois Ponts gone. Forced onto smaller roads toward La Glaise and Stoumont, Piper lost the ability to mass and maneuver. Once the weather cleared, air attacked road knots and fuel dumps while American engineers blew culverts behind him. By 24 December, the group was encircled. Orders to hold could not conjure fuel or bridges. The men abandoned heavy vehicles at night and slipped east. The sharpest northern sword was gone. At Saint-Vith, the German plan took another wound measured in days. The town had no fixed defenses worth the name, but its roads tied the Bulge's traffic together. From 17 to 21 December, mixed U.S. forces held a ring that kept westbound movement organized and eastbound pursuit disordered. When orders came to withdraw, they did so in stages, each phase covered by artillery and rear guards. The bend that the Germans forced into the map cost them the calendar. Divisions that should have been driving for the Meuse were instead detouring on churned side roads toward a road net that American units were now seeding with blocks and ambushes. The relief of Bastogne was the visible sign that the initiative had flipped. On 26 December, tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through at Assenois and crossed into the perimeter in late afternoon. The corridor was narrow and under fire, not a broad opening, but it restored a two-way flow of ammunition fuel and medical evacuation. German Corps commanders now faced a choice they had hoped to force on the Allies: continue spending fuel and battalions against a reconnected fortress, or pull back to cover the retreat of the deepest spearheads before they were cut off. Orders show vacillation over the next 48 hours as higher headquarters clung to the Antwerp aim, while divisional staffs counted lighters and hours. Command friction on the German side hardened into failure when the air war shifted again. On 1 January, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a low-level strike against Allied airfields designed to buy back freedom of movement at the front. It wrecked aircraft on the ground, but at catastrophic cost in pilots and machines that Germany could not replace. Meanwhile, the ground forces still faced clear sky interdiction day after day. The intended effect, 3 to 5 days of air denial in mid-December, had been achieved. It was gone at the moment when engines, depots, and road discipline most needed protection. By early January, the geometry of decision was clear. The northern shoulder remained anchored on Elsenborn. The Meuse crossings were intact in Allied hands. Bastogne was connected and thickening with reinforcements. The deepest penetration at Celles had recoiled. German formations in the salient were burning fuel to hold exposed salients that no longer pointed to a practicable river crossing. On the Allied side, the same road network that had hindered the defense now served the counteroffensive. Traffic control routed fresh combat commands to named axes, while Corps' artillery leapfrogged west to east, always within cable range of forward observers. Numbers mattered because time did. The German plan had assumed a rate of advance that would reach the Meuse around the 5th day and seize fuel en route. Against a defended river line under clear skies with the northern wall unbroken and a fortress still alive in the center, that rate became unattainable. Reports up the chain from Corps to Army Group noted fuel returns in single digits of planned allotments, bridge parks exhausted, and engineer units worn down by constant repairs under fire. American returns recorded ammunition economies in early days, replaced by normal expenditure once air resupply stabilized. Bastogne and truck columns began rolling north in strength. The decisive actions were therefore cumulative rather than singular. A ridge that never fell, bridges that never opened to the attacker, a fortress that refused to die long enough to be relieved, a river line that was defended before the first German tank crested the last ridge, an air force that left the field for a week and then came back, and a theater command that turned reserves into presence faster than its opponent could adjust its aim. The Bulge had taken shape in a week. In the next 10 days, its fate was sealed by roads, fuel, and orders that could not bend as quickly as the map required. By early January, the salient was shrinking under pressure from north and south. The road town names that had marked the advance, Saint-Vith, Houffalize, La Roche, now marked the retreat. Columns burned fuel to hold bends in the line that no longer pointed to any river crossing. Rear guards laid mines on village edges, blew culverts at dusk, and fell back along roads lined with disabled vehicles. At Houffalize, on 16 January, armored spearheads from 1st Army and 3rd Army met and closed the gap. The Bulge became a pocketed front with German divisions extracting as best they could on churned tracks through the Eifel. Artillery shifted target lists from interdiction to withdrawal routes. Air units attacked daylight traffic and depots when weather allowed. The initiative was settled. Losses told the cost in men and materiel that Germany could not afford. American returns for the Ardennes campaign recorded about 80,000 casualties across killed, wounded, missing, and captured. German totals are less certain but run from the high 60,000s to near 100,000 when prisoners and frost cases are included. What made the balance decisive was replacement. The United States could refill rifle companies and gun crews from depots and training centers and rotate divisions to rest areas before the next offensive. Germany could not. The attack consumed assault platoons that had taken months to rebuild after summer losses. It wrote off tanks and assault guns that production would not replace in time for the battles that followed on the Roer and the Rhine. The armored park that went forward in mid-December came back thinner in January or not at all. Panthers and Panzer IVs left on roadsides for lack of fuel were blown by their crews. Heavy battalions with Tiger II spent engines and final drives on steep icy grades and then fought as static batteries when petrol ran out. Artillery groups fired away ready stocks in the first week and then rationed tubes for the retreat. Engineer units exhausted by constant bridging and road repair under shell fire had to be pulled back to reconstitute. The Luftwaffe's New Year's Day strike on Allied airfields wrecked aircraft on the ground, but cost hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and machines. From 23 December onward, daylight movement west of the hour remained a risk Germany could not mitigate. The operational window that the plan had counted on several days without Allied air had closed and would not reopen. The political and strategic effects ran beyond the map of the Ardennes. In the west, the offensive removed any remaining Allied doubt about German intentions and capacity. It ended talk of a rapid winter end by negotiation. It hardened operational priorities around weight of materiel and method. Eisenhower's headquarters tightened theater traffic control, rehearsed quick shifts of army boundaries, and formalized procedures for instant artillery reinforcement by corps groups. American and British staffs built the late winter plan on those lessons, a deliberate crossing of major rivers supported by bridging parks' air interdiction schedules keyed to weather windows, and deep reserves positioned on road nets for exploitation rather than crisis response. For Germany, the gamble foreclosed options that might have stayed open with a purely defensive winter. Armor and trained NCOs spent in the Ardennes were absent in February and March, when the Allies forced the Roer and then the Rhine. Fuel drawn down for the offensive left depots bare, just as retreat stretched supply lines across a denser grid of destroyed bridges. Command cohesion suffered under the strain of orders that pressed for Antwerp long after the timetable had collapsed. When orders finally shifted to extraction and defense, the divisions that should have covered the West Wall were already committed and worn. Alsace drew more formations into costly fighting during Operation Nordwind, without changing the decision in the Ardennes or restoring a reserve. The Eastern Front magnified the bill. On 12 January, the Red Army opened its Vistula-Oder offensive. With armored divisions tied down or rebuilding in the west and rail arteries overloaded by the Ardennes supply effort, German High Command had little capacity to shift weight to the east. The winter crisis thus became dual. The offensive in the Ardennes did not buy time against the Soviets. It surrendered it. What was intended as a Western decision became a drain that reduced the ability to respond to the greater threat across the Vistula and Nariv. Bastogne's relief and the collapse of the spearheads near Celles also had effects that were less visible but operationally durable. Air supply to a surrounded garrison validated the scale and method of theater logistics under fire. It confirmed that a fortress defense tied to artillery and engineer work could hold long enough for a planned relief if road and air nets could be made to function. For the remainder of the war in the West, American staffs applied the same pattern to riverheads and bridgeheads, build strongpoints linked by flexible artillery keep roads, open by strict traffic control, and use air to punish enemy concentration whenever weather allowed. In the German files, the lesson landed in reverse: avoid fighting for road hubs under enemy air preserve fuel for night moves, and accept earlier withdrawals when a node became a magnet for artillery. The Army could record the lesson, but lacked the means to act on it. Civilians in the Ardennes paid a price that the maps could not show. Winter evacuees trudged along the same roads as armor columns. Town centers that had been spared in September now burned under artillery duels and street fights. Bridges blown to deny tanks also severed local food and coal supply. The campaign's end left villages with gutted churches, blocked wells, and fields cratered and sown with mines. Relief columns followed the armies with food and fuel, but reconstruction would lag war's end by months and years. In Allied capitals, the initial shock of the December attack gave way to a sharpened sense of what counted in the final push. Intelligence assessments acknowledged warning failures in the quiet sector and proposed more weight to rail photo coverage and prisoner processing in winter. Training circulars distilled the defensive fight at Elsenborn and the road battles around St. Vith into practical notes register artillery on likely road cuts. Pair engineers and MPs at choke points. Keep small anti-tank teams forward in villages to force armored columns to deploy. The larger doctrine was continuity. Success had come not from one weapon or a single heroic stand, but from a chain engineer's artillery road control and air linked by command that reacted within a day at theater scale. By the close of January, the front had straightened and then edged east beyond the start lines of 16 December. The bulge that had threatened the Meuse was gone. In its place lay a battered German army and an Allied force still intact in its depots and command structures. The balance of resources, already uneven in autumn, tilted further. When the Rhine crossings opened in March, they did so over an enemy who had spent his last operational reserve in the Ardennes and received nothing lasting in return. The final months in the West would be hard and costly, but the outcome after the winter gamble was no longer in doubt. The historical assessment of the Ardennes turns on proportion rather than drama. Most scholars agree on three findings. First, Germany achieved surprise at the tactical level on 16 December, but lacked the logistics and road capacity to convert that shock into an operational decision. Second, Allied command reacted faster and at a larger scale than the attacker, turning dispersed reserves into a coherent plan within 24 hours, hold Elsenborn, defend the Meuse, relieve Bastogne. Third, once weather cleared on 23 December, air interdiction and resupply multiplied the effect of artillery and road control. The offensive culminated before any bridgehead over the Meuse could form. Debate persists over emphasis. One school centers Bastogne as the battle's hinge, arguing that the road hub fixed 5th Panzer Army, and bought the days that destroyed the timetable. Another points to Elsenborn Ridge in St. Vith, where artillery and traffic denial on the northern shoulder prevented the strongest armored group from ever reaching the open country east of the Meuse. A third stresses the Meuse line itself. By 19 December, bridges were guarded demolitions set and armored counterforces staged, so even a deeper thrust would have met a prepared river defense. These views are not mutually exclusive. They describe a chain in which each link reinforced the others. Intelligence is assessed with similar nuance. Allied warning in the Ardennes sector was late and incomplete, the product of improved German radio discipline, winter weather, and analytic bias toward expected patterns. Yet most historians judge that earlier alarm would have thickened the line rather than changed the campaign's geometry. The deciding variables were roads, bridges, fuel, and command tempo once the attack began. On the German side, planners counted on captured petrol and short windows of air denial. Both assumptions failed under the friction of terrain and a defender able to mass artillery within hours. The operational lessons were absorbed quickly because they fit patterns validated since Normandy. For the Allies, artillery remained the primary killer when observation existed. Air power was decisive when the sky cooperated. Engineers and military police controlled outcomes by keeping chosen roads open and chosen bridges standing. The Bastogne air resupply proved that a fortress defense tied to radios and mapped fires could live long enough for a planned relief even in winter. For Germany, the mirror lesson was stark. Armored thrusts, tied to one or two paved axes, could not outpace a defender who controlled lateral movement and owned the sky after the first week. Material balances explain the strategic weight of the battle's losses. The United States replaced infantry crews and vehicles from deep depots and training centers. Germany could not. Tanks destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel were not replaced before the Rohr and Rhine operations. Operation Bodenplatte on 1 January inflicted damage on airfields but cost pilots and aircraft. Germany needed to shield its road nets. From late December onward, daylight movement west of the Our remained hazardous and fuel expenditure climbed as columns detoured and idled. The broader legacy lies in how the Ardennes shaped the final campaign plan. Eisenhower's headquarters codified theater-level traffic control, rapid boundary shifts, and pre-written march tables for reserve movements. Corps artillery learned to leapfrog in blocks while maintaining wire links to forward observers. Air tasking cycles were keyed to forecast windows to maximize bridge and road interdiction. By March, the same system supported river crossings and pursuit east of the Rhine. In German files, post-action analyses urged earlier withdrawal from road hubs under enemy air and stricter fuel husbandry for night moves. The Army recorded those lessons, but lacked the means to apply them. Memory and myth also diverged. Post-war narratives often sought a single decisive moment or unit. The record shows cumulative effects. A ridge that did not fall, a road hub that did not die, a river line defended before the spearheads arrived, and a sky that turned hostile at the wrong time for the attacker. Where numbers remain disputed, casualty totals, write-offs versus repairables, the ranges do not change the conclusion that the offensive spent formations Germany could not rebuild, and left the Allies with intact depots and command. The Ardennes endures because it clarifies a truth of modern war. Surprise and courage can open a door, but only logistics, roads, and time keep it open. In December 1944, those belonged to the defender.